thank you so much for coming. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to come, and the fact some of you are on your holiday and others are sort of straight out of a workshop. I'd like to thank Wallace Cowling and Sadiq for this invitation to come. I spend part of my time in Australia, but I'm resident in Switzerland, and I travel in Africa mainly. And when Wallace asked me to speak, I thought, well, why not talk about something that I know, but something that is a little bit different to sort of stimulate our discussion, and particularly because we're here at university. So this term, entrepreneurship, I thought might be fun and interesting to sort of raise the discussion. So I am going to talk about the program that I work on and the organization I work on, but hopefully what it will do is stimulate sort of thoughts around this sort of aspect about entrepreneurialism. So what I was going to do, if I can just make sure I know how to do this, is to basically just introduce you not to who I am, but to the organization I work for, just a little bit. Talk about, just set the table out on what I'm talking about when we're referring to entrepreneurship, because I know you have programs here in this topic. And then specifically to start sort of thinking about market-led approaches to crop improvement particularly, but the principles are applicable. It doesn't really matter whether you're talking about plants, animals, or actually services when you start to think about this, because the fundamentals are very similar across whatever product you are considering. And specifically to look at the example of trying to introduce sort of novel thinking and novel approaches within an African context, and we've got some African colleagues here. I'm looking at Daniel particularly because we've had contact. The program that I've worked on has been running for about 4 years, and we're going into a second phase. So I'm going to mention what we've done, but really I think have the discussion about what we're doing next. So just to introduce it all, so I work for the Syngenta Foundation, and this is it's a charity. It's a not-for-profit Swiss charity. But the money that we are funded by comes from it's corporate profit, straight out of one of the world's biggest agribusinesses, okay? But we match it with partnering money. And we have an independent executive board. We do not work for the company. We are not owned by the company. We're completely separate. But one of the joys of actually working in the foundation is we can sort of reach into skills and knowledge and advice and expertise in the company. I've mentioned it already, but we always work in partnerships. And it's to do with scale. We're a relatively small foundation as foundations go. And what we do is we try to facilitate interactions between public and private and civil society. Specifically, what we try and do is to catalyze and innovate and scale innovations in partnership. We don't scale things by ourselves. We're too small. And this is all about smallholder farmers. So our mission is to basically try to help farmers to create value for themselves in developing countries through innovation, sustainable agriculture, and activation of value chains. What that means is essentially being able to operate better in markets. And we have, just in terms of scale, there's 190 staff, and we're operating in Africa and in Asia. We have offices or arrangements in these countries in Africa and Asia. So if we look at Africa, although we only have an office in Kenya, we reach out across the whole of East Africa into West Africa, and I'll talk about some of that. Asia, many of the poorer places in Asia, and it goes beyond those countries, but that's where we have people actually on the ground. And we have a head office in Switzerland, which is where the corporate head office is for the company as well. We have 3 focus streams or areas of work that we have experts in. And that's one of the differences between our foundation and other organizations that provide support into developing countries, is we do have expertise in our organization. We're not just doing project management. So we bring know-how and contacts and networks to the challenge. So the 3 streams that we been told this is the pointer. I'm going to have fun with this. So agri-services. So the challenge is basically, difficulties with linking to the market. The extension service doesn't reach far enough or work as well as it would be like. Farmers are missing out on being able to get best prices. They're not getting access to inputs, all the things that you would list out that And the approach that we take is very much around trying to give farmers a voice and power through aggregation. And there's a major program around agri-entrepreneurship in India, and it's huge. So what this is about basically trying to enable farmers, and it's typically rural youth, unemployed rural youth, who have the wherewithal and want to learn skills to provide services in their community. And so they provide resources and training to do that. It's quite extensive. And the ones that are successful basically have little businesses within their community. And the numbers, I was looking up the numbers with a colleague, 1,800 agri-entrepreneurs are actually operating on the ground now. They each serve sort of around 100 to 200 farmers in their communities. And the goal is to basically provide, at the moment, so there's 250,000 farmers at the moment who are getting services from this mechanism, and the goal is to try and get to 20 million farmers over the next 5 years. And it looks like it's possible, and there's support with the government. It's not done in isolation. It's absolutely in harmony and with support from the people in the enabling environment. The second area, and I don't want to go on too long, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So risk and insurance is something you don't always hear about, but we have specialists in insurance and microfinancing, trying to get access. There's a problem getting access to credit. High production risk, people don't reinvest into their little properties. They're too busy on the here and now. So it's about trying to help them get small amounts of finance and affordable insurance, so that if they have crop failure, then they can do something about it. But the area that I work in, and this is one of the biggest areas, is around seeds. And the challenge basically in many countries is getting access to quality seeds at affordable price that perform well. So we work, if I just move it on, so this is the area that I work in. And so it's sort of seeds business, if you want, plus capacity building, which involves training, but also research and development. So we have a program called Seeds to Be, which involves actually testing, evaluating varieties in these countries for a whole range of SME type companies. We typically work with SMEs, not big multinationals, to be able to encourage them to test what the varieties they've got to see whether they will work and serve in these environments. It's about connecting basically varieties with companies. It's about helping people understand IP, trying to get regulation and harmonization so you can have varieties being used in more than one country without paying for full release processes. But the area that I work in, and this is really where I'll focus, is in the area of plant breeding, particularly new variety design around development processes, training programs in this demand-led breeding approach. So if we just sort of step out of all of that and sort of start to think of, well, what if I say entrepreneurship, what am I talking about? I actually scouted around looking, and I wonder what you're taught on the courses here, but this comes from experience in business, but also reading around the topic as well. So typically people think about entrepreneurship as two things. It's having an ability to basically sort of have an invention and do something with it, organize, get money for it, get people on board with it, take it out, make it into a business, get remuneration, keep the thing moving. So entrepreneurship is linked with creating business and having the wherewithal to do that. That's sort of the classical definition. But it also involves sort of a process. It involves process where you're identifying opportunities. So you see something, but you realize there's an opportunity, and you put the two together, sort of the invention and the opportunity. And you get the resources to follow your energy to do business. When we talk in SPSA about business, it's about empowering smallholder farmers and their livelihoods. It's not about agri-business, multinationals and everything. Business to us is about farmer business, farmer businesses. Okay. And entrepreneurial skills that go with making this linkage typically run something like this, and I'm sure every person in this room has got all of this or some of this. So it's about creating something new and different. It may not be a product, maybe knowledge, it could be all sorts of things, services, not necessarily variety. That we get excited about finding new possibilities. That when we're out and about, we can see something, we can see maybe that there's a market need that's not being met, or a market that's not being, either a need or a market that's not being served well. And we typically start with a problem and then try and find a solution to it, rather than finding a technology and then looking for a home for it or something we can do or make money out of. I'd say that the best sort of, really the entrepreneurial skills it's about having social influence. You don't do this on your own. It sort of involves people. And you convince them, you win their interest, you convince them that they should join you in some way, whether it's borrowing or using their knowledge or money or whatever it is. So essentially there is communication skill here to win interest. And typically I put a high ability, but it's a higher desire to learn new things. If you're going to innovate and you're going to do entrepreneurial things, it typically hasn't been done before. So you've got to learn new stuff you don't know and try new things. And typically it does involve some robustness. You're not called an entrepreneur if everything fails at the end. Typically you push your way through the failure till you succeed. And you have I've put an unwavering eye on the end goal. You're always motivated by what it is you can achieve. And in the work that I do, I see all of this in bits and in total. In certain people, they're entrepreneurs. Often you find breeders, they are entrepreneurs. They're creating products in science. What products do you, as an individual, create? Normally you're part of something. But a breeder with a breeding team creates a tangible product. So if I move on and put this into sort of context now, and slow down a little bit, all right? I know I've been going fast. But this sort of idea of demand-led plant breeding sort of occurred actually as a result of a piece of data. I went to the opening of the Australian International, it was the African Food Security Centre. It was opened some years back. And there were a lot of African speakers and basically talked about varietal adoption. And there are a number of people sitting in the audience, and what I saw, because I wasn't an expert around any of this, this specific element around adoption in Africa or developing countries. And what we were told, and I'll actually show you the data set, and the data was published fully in 2014, that only 35% adoption of modern varieties were taking place in sub-Saharan Africa from a specific study. Only 14 out of 20 staple food crops, 14 out of the 20, you got modern varieties that were being released, but people weren't using them. And so I and a number of other people thought, blooming heck, what the heck's that all about? Resources are scarce, it's not easy to do this stuff, and then, the varieties are not being used. And this was the actual data set, and I put it up because science typically and ideas come from situations and data, and this certainly was the case for me. And by chance, there were other people in the audience, and we were on a bus on one of these post-workshop tours to look at some goat breeding, I think it was actually. And we sat and talked about it and said, goodness me, what's this all about? And there was so much energy, we thought, well, we need to find out why. Why is this happening? What is it? And so there was a big blank. Why is it happening? And so we talked to lots of people, and you got the usual sort of stuff, which was, oh, well, there's no seed systems. Oh, the extension service doesn't work. Oh, people don't know the new varieties are available. All the things that we would suggest. And you look in the literature and you find it too. And I said, okay, and everybody then said, oh, well, that's it. I said, no. I come from a product invention development background. If you've got a product that works really, really well, usually it finds a home for itself. It moves. and particularly in Africa, people steal it. You know, people will use it, whether you want to call it stealing or not. It will move if it's really good and serves its purpose. So a number of us thought, well, actually, let's test that as a hypothesis, that the reason why there aren't more varieties adopted is because the product doesn't provide the benefits that people really want, and maybe they haven't heard about them as well. So went into this sort of approach and really investigating. The next step was to say, well, what's happening within the science regime and in the breeding communities? And what we found, and you have to bear in mind the timetable and the scale and the people who are doing the work, is this is more than 5 years ago now, we were still absolutely, as it is now, accelerating away with the genomics revolution, where people desperately wanted to keep up to date with the molecular breakthroughs. You had all of the, many of the genomes were being sequenced at this time, and so you've got a community of Africans who had got their PhDs and MScs, often abroad, and they really wanted to keep up with the science. So they're desperately trying to do this. And so what they're doing is following the science and then sort of asking people, and doing participatory breeding, for sure they were. You know, they were talking to local farmers. But essentially it was going in this direction. And they might do their participatory appraisal when they did their study, but they don't go back and do another one, because it's much more pleasant to do science than it is to go out and talk to smallholders. I mean, I'm putting in a bit of bias here, but typically as scientists, we want to do science. You know, the idea we go out and do market research, you know, that's not what we do. So a lot of it was being sort of driven by production and science. But actually, if you look at where the private sector lives or dies, it's by understanding what these people want, these people as consumers as well, and then working backwards and saying, okay, this is what we think the market will do this if we provide that. So they start at the other end. And typically you meet somewhere in the middle, because the science has got to deliver what you can dream up. But what we set up was a project that was saying the balance between really following the science and the technology versus actually understanding the markets and the needs. It had gone too far, and it needed to be pulled back a bit. So this project started really with those fundamentals behind it. So saying, actually, if the markets want its variety, you know, you'll get adoption. And we tend to talk about demand, not markets, because in many of these countries, the markets are not there, or they're not, you know, they're maybe on the rise, but they're just emerging. So if you do market research, you won't bother, because there is no business. So that's why we talk about demand, understanding demand. So the goal that we set ourselves, which is pretty huge, but we thought we'd have a go, was basically to support African breeders to create high-performing varieties, but very customer-focused, so they'd be adopted, really to help the farmers participate in markets, not stay subsistence farmers. Nobody wants to be a subsistence farmer. You always want to produce more and do better. And this was set up basically in partnership with this community. So, and this is how I came to work with Australian experts like yourselves. So with the ACIR supporting, with the Crawford Fund, which is a public-private partnership, University of Queensland, and absolutely critical African R&D partners. And we went looking for people. We went looking for entrepreneurial. So it was, in a sense, if you like, donor-driven to start with. But there was a lot of consultation before we started to find people who really wanted to do this stuff. And the people that we found we looked where the best education was taking place in Africa. And there are three centres where now there are over 300 PhD trained African plant breeders in sub-Saharan Africa, from a very, very small number. And the education is taking place in West Africa and Ghana, at Aki, which is in KwaZulu-Natal, University of KwaZulu-Natal, near Durban, Makerere University, and there are many other universities that train people, and South Africa we didn't put South Africa in the mix at that point. University of Nairobi. So Paul Kamani actually runs his own sort of plant breeding business. So absolute entrepreneur. He works with the bean canning industry. He gets royalties that come back into the university. I don't think he gets them personally, but basically there's a system where there's remuneration. And he's wired as a developer, absolute plant breeder, but wired to think in this way. And then the government of Rwanda and a range of sort of Pan-African or regional organizations see it very much because if you look in Africa, the bean people in Africa and PABRA, the Pan-African Bean Team, they've been really on this journey for a long time. It was more about getting their skills higher rather than starting from scratch. And there's a bioscience center, I don't know if anyone knows it, in Nairobi called, well, you probably do because of ILRI, it's the livestock center, but they have a biosciences. It's probably recognized as, in terms of concentration, they do a lot of capacity building and breeders go in to get trained in molecular methods and a whole range of other things. Some of you come from the CGIAR. And the approach we decided to take was based on how varieties get into farmers, and it's the national programs that release the varieties. They're absolutely dependent in Africa on the CG centres, the international centres, and the work they do. But at the end, the varieties are typically, not everywhere, typically released by the national programs. And many, many programs focus on the CG system that rock into the national programs, and we decided we wanted to do it the other way around. So the how, so we went after what is the best practice. You want to design a variety? What's the best practice? Where's the textbooks? I went out looking for, basically, who's teaching this stuff? I'll get my hands on it, and then we just have to try and sort of shape it a bit, and everybody change it to their, the way they want it, but that's what would happen. When I started to look, the only place I found, I'm looking at Wallace now, is actually in Saskatchewan. There was one, I mean, probably I didn't look hard enough, but there was one little module that had a little bit on this, how do you design a variety? Basically, we decided we were going to try and get best practices and introduce them to the certificated programs and also workshops for professional breeders who they're working in their normal workplace. We also were looking to see, well, does this actually work in practice? So to try and help a couple of programs, one was in Ghana, the other is basically beans in East Africa, to try and see whether it works in practice. And then basically trying to convince people that what we thought we were doing was a good idea, and see whether people, a bit like this entrepreneurship, trying to win sort of support. And what we focused on, because I know you do have this as part of there's a master's program at Willie Erskine and Armin talk about some of this. But this was a blank piece of paper at this point when we started. So we focused in. So all those people in Africa with private sector experts together worked out that maybe we need to focus on these elements. So client needs and preferences, a lot on value chains, looking at markets, thinking about the future because it takes a long time, market research, how to do that, what are the performance standards, where are the priorities for different traits, integrating best practices from different communities, and very much advocating a multidisciplinary approach, which people do. Some people are hugely multidisciplinary in some of their public programs, some of them are not. And then what we did was basically create a module that encapsulated all of that best practice, which has chapters like this. So there's units on the principles, the visioning, and so forth. With a particular emphasis, I would say, on variety. The whole thing's about design, trying to understand which traits are important, where does the value lie, and trying to work out, because this is all about what breeding goals you're going to set. So it's all about understanding where the opportunity lies for whatever it is you're going to create. And this is just a method that gets used. But what it did do is bring to the front, and now many of you take this for granted now. I mean, in the CG, you're getting this every day of the week. is this concept of product profiles. And this is how basically the good companies do their development work. And it's about sort of looking at all of the different possible traits that you might come up with, which ones are useful, who are you doing it for, knowing what the best varieties out there, what the choices are that people can make. Are they going to choose yours? If you're a smallholder farmer, it's all very well somebody like me saying, oh, well, this is better, have a look. Their whole world depends on it. They're hugely risk averse typically, because they have to know that crop isn't going to fail. It is going to do what you say it's going to do. So would we completely change something in our lives when we're totally dependent? Not readily, I would suggest. We would need to be convinced over a period of time. And what this then leads into is this all gets factored down to a set of traits, because you can't breed for like 40 traits. That's ridiculous. It's hard. You know, breeding usually it comes down to a few traits, probably no more than 5 at a time, just because of the complexity of it all. And then, and so what do I mean by a product profile? If you haven't come across this term, this is just one aspect. So what does your variety do when it's harvested or stored? And the key thing is you have a list of traits that you know are important. You have some sort of quantification. So there's measurement involved. You have a variety that you know does what you want. And then you say you have a target. And this is the difference between classical breeding. You absolutely have a target you have to meet. And if you don't meet it, then you have to reflect on whether that's ever going to be successful. What often happens is people say, oh, well, we'll have a go. And if it doesn't meet it, and then it doesn't get adopted. So it's about having, if you can't get to where you feel you need to do more market research to see whether people will accept it or not, or whether they won't. And this all turned into, we never started out like this to do this, but instead of writing a donor report on all of this, what my African colleagues and I decided to do with Gabrielle was to basically put it all in a book that people could benefit from. And Daniel's got one with him. I forgot to bring one. So it's full of basically, it's a textbook. It doesn't make good bedtime reading. It's very dense, but it's a reference book on doing this stuff. And I know when my boss said, I said, look, we want to publish a textbook. He said, you're not an academic. I don't pay you to be an academic. I said, no, Marco, no. This isn't about being academic. This is about having a product. This is a product because we want to advocate this stuff. And a lot of people have shown interest in it. So where are we now? And this is really the start of the next sort of phase. So during this first 3-year period, there were workshops going on with this training material. And 357 at the last count people have been exposed by coming on workshops. And of those, 285 of them are plant breeders. This is a big stretch across Africa. And I'll show you more data so you can see what it looks like. So in total, there are about what we like to think of 400 alumni who have thought about these concepts. Most of them are Africa, that's our target audience, and is led in Africa. So all the training's done by African professors or experts or plant breeders. There's not a foreigner in sight. This is all African-led. We exposed this a couple of years ago to students at University of Queensland, and that's that number, and there were a few visiting people that were around that came. So there have been 21 workshops by these different, organised by these different groups. I think I've already said that. So Africa was the target of those. And these, just because it is important, that male and female split, sort of just under 30% of women. And that reflects people who are doing this sort of work. That's not because they've been excluded. It's typically there aren't that many women breeders. And then if you look at the institutions of who came on these workshops, you can see here the vast majority came from the NARS, with some representation, a lot from CIMMET actually, a few ICRISAT people, a few people from SIP, and a number from the universities. And this was deliberate. Then the countries, it's very broad range. We weren't targeting certain countries. Basically, it's people who'd been educated as breeders and working as breeders in Africa. So 28 countries across West, Central, East. And again, not concentrating on any particular crops. Over 30 crops, but there's something to be said here. So if you look at what crops people work on, there's a real tail end. You can see here, well, obviously for the staples, maize and beans, but that also reflect donor interest too. If you start to look at vegetables and stuff, it's very, very little, very few people. It's all on the calorie-based crops and pulses. So going into the next phase, because I do want us to have time to discuss things. We thought very long and hard, well, what are we going to do next? Is there an appetite to do this? And this is basically what people wanted to do. I'm just sort of presenting it. So phase one was all about really principles, how to do more market-based thinking, entrepreneurial type thinking. Phase two is all about really deep diving further, but particularly trying to support all those people to do something with their varieties. The ones they've got, the ones coming down the track, to look back to where maybe they change things or do different selections. So how to identify and accelerate promising varieties. And our mission is to try, we believe to get really scale and particularly sustainability. And this is, maybe you don't agree with us, but our sort of belief in the foundation is you get sustainability with markets. If you put in dollops of money from the government or donors, that dries up. It doesn't keep things going. When the money stops, everything stops. If markets drive things, then they tend to keep going. So what we're trying to do is to help the public sector breeders and programs to connect with the private sector to try and see where varieties have potential to scale and to get partnerships going. And to not let good varieties, or if the programs are producing varieties where the private sector is saying, well, look, we just don't think we can do this, is that the programs change onto more market-driven traits. So we've got some new partners that have come on board. We haven't lost anybody, actually, but more people want to join in this endeavour. So Wallace and Sadiq are much more involved now in this program and partnering with some sister work as well. The Ethiopian Institute, so EAIR, that's the national program, they are rolling this out across all of their breeders. They've got 300 breeders at over 20 institutes. They're all going to teach or expose their people. And it's already started. In Ghana, there was a workshop recently, same thing, all of the breeders in Ghana, where the government is saying they want them to do this. The GREAT program, I don't know if you've come across this, so this is a gender-based program. The lady, Anne Tufan, has just won the Borlaug Prize, I think, for agriculture. She's the lady that I work with on this, and it's about strengthening what we're doing on gender in the program and the training. The World Veg Centre is involved as well. We have an MOU with globally with the Veg Centre. CIMIT are particularly interested. Also, some of Jean-Marcel and the BMS organisation is on board, and the Excellence in Breeding programme. We know and we love them, and they're involved, and we try and help each other where we can. But what are we going to actually do? This is where we feel the gap is in terms of connecting research with private enterprise. And it's two things. One is more around what's the design of the product, but really bringing in more foresight. So I was talking to the head of tomato breeding in Syngenta, and it's got one of the biggest vegetable programs in the world. And she was telling me about a variety where, and this is 20 years ago, where, cherry tomatoes, and you get the nice plum ones, their baby plum is so the segment is the cherry tomato, but then you've got these elongated ones that you can put in the fridge and eat it a week later and they still taste great. They're snacking tomatoes, basically. And 20 years ago, they saw this cherry segment, and they knew that, and they saw that there was a big, look, coming forward. I mean, if you think back 20 years, I mean, this idea of sort of healthy eating, fast food, sort of convenience food. If you're middle class, you're busy, you want stuff you can, get your hands on that's good for you as well. And so that was foresight. So the market wasn't there. They thought, if we can produce something like this with these characteristics, who knows what could happen? So it wasn't they came across a morphological mutant, which was that shape, and they thought, well, let's see if people like it. It was absolutely sort of, and we're doing a case study around that, and it spawned a sort of a whole, and that set the benchmark that everybody else chased, because they produced the consumer requirements, but also needed sort of high generation tomatoes, because it was in the Dutch greenhouses this started, where you've got to have, you breed for that environment. It's not the same as breeding under plastic or outdoors. So this is how the private sector do it. They get it right sometimes, they don't get it right others. There's no reason why the public sector can't do it. As individuals, you can't do this. So more around this sort of looking forward piece and how to do that. But the big thing is around the promising varieties, and particularly the promising programs. And the key thing here, there's a few things, and I'll come back to and explain. So one is about what are the standards that are set. So what is it? Not just what does a company want. What will they believe? Can you actually talk to them in a way they'll even understand what you're saying? I don't know if I used to be in really the furthest, most sort of upstream research. And you talk to commercial people in a company, everybody says, oh, go talk to the commercial people. And you talk to them, and they've got the attention span of about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And it just floats by them. They don't understand the language, and we don't understand them. So there's something about skills that are needed around communicating technical information, making a pitch and making a case for what it is you've got, so that you can scale and also hopefully win breeding investment as well. So the way we've started this, the way we started this is to try and reach out to the alumni, and they are responding right now, of what varieties they've got coming. So what advanced lines have they got? What have they got in the system? What's just come out of the release system? So what stage are their varieties? What benefit? Who are they targeting them for? Who are they trying to reach? What do they see the benefits of the varieties are? A bit more detail around the release stuff. How are they going to get their variety to the farmers? Have they got a distribution strategy? They may already have got arrangements. Maybe they haven't. And are they interested to try and do new things with new partners? And Nasser Yao, who's a molecular breeder, is leading all of this. And we've had about 130 responses from breeders based in national programs who've got, they're producing end varieties. But it's still ongoing, and this is how we're going to try and reach back to the community. Just a few more things. So, and this is for you now. If you do work on whatever it is, whether it's a plant or you're breeding animals, seminal questions. So, how well do you know what you've got? How confident are you to make claims about it? What standard are you trying to meet? Is it just the release committee? In my view, as a commercial person, that's not much of a standard. Yes, you've got to get through it, but it's not when you're talking about somebody paying for what you're producing. How much testing have you done to sort of justify what you're saying? And do you know where the full value lies versus other options? Have you really looked at the preferences of farmers and things like gender? Could your variety have other uses? You may have produced it for one thing, but does it have other properties? Can it go other places? What assumptions would you give to an investor? Just say there's a private small seed company. What will you say to them about what your variety does? And there's a gap. Again, I went looking for this stuff. Even in the companies, they don't have stuff on setting the standards. It's just you do it because you know that's what you do. You learn it at work. But the advanced skills that everyone thinks is needed about communicating the value, it's all about what's called variety positioning. Technical assumptions, claims, data sheets, engaging making pitches to do something around that. And then this other piece around compelling cases. So what does a quality data sheet look like? I thought I'd pick out Pioneer's corn list this year. What it's got here is, yeah, it's got traits. It's sort of got a ranking system. I'm not sure I'd buy it on that. They've got a lot more behind it. If you go onto most of the websites, they actually get farmers giving advertisements, plaudits for particular varieties. So it's all about sort of reputational things plus data. So essentially, data sheets and communication, it's about your audience, about comparative data, it's about clear positioning, photos, other things. But what do I mean by positioning? Because this is the bit that I see missing when I'm out and about. And I can look at the Agra book of varieties that have all, you know, it's a wonderful book that Joe de Vries has put together, but I cannot look at that book and know which ones are any good. So it's a term that describes how a variety can be presented in the market, and it sort of basically goes through what's different about it, what's really different about it, how are you going to sell it, what assumptions do you make, and then that goes into basically a business case, it goes into a marketing campaign, and it takes time to do this, and you're checking over lots of things. And so I went after some really good examples. I looked everywhere, and Australia has some of the best I can find in terms of work in this area. So this is, because I work with bean breeders, this is Pulse data sheet that's come out of the Pulse Australia, Pulse Breeding Australia. And it goes through a variety of things. It has data in there. But the key thing it has is there's lots of specificity, lots about adaptation for particular places versus standard number of sites, numbers of seasons. And this is something. Locations not recommended. Like, where's it not been tested? You don't know. Or you've got weak positioning. And this really matters. And then this is like some of the positioning statements. All right, and this is a big organization. But the reason I want to raise this is because your reputation is on the line here as a breeder or as a product maker. So you want to promote it, of course you do, because you believe in it. And you want to get recognition for your efforts. But be very, very clear. Your professional reputation's on the line if you start making performance claims. And the reputation of your institute. And if you get it wrong and it is commercialized by a seed company, they're going to go after you. And not only that, maybe not so much in Africa, other farmers will go after you. So there's a lovely, I quite like this, it's a lovely bit of cheese, but you've got to get it right. So, and if we look at financial damages, I was looking for cases, and this one is here and now in Australia, and you probably know more about it than me, and it's a case to do with barley, and it was actually sort of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, so this is not a private case, this is a public organisation that supports consumers. Sued SeedNet, one of your biggest distributor organizations, about barley performance for a variety called Compass, and it was 2016. It was positioned as having superior anti-lodging and rust resistance versus Commander. All right, in one of these data sheets, the people out there selling were pushing this. And basically it must have failed. I assume it was lodging or something. And there was so much money left on the table that people took action. And at the end of last year, you're talking a huge amount of money. This was taken to court and they were fined. And this will roll most seed companies. Smaller seed companies wouldn't be able to survive this. And it was all based on misleading marketing. And the evidence in the technical data sheet was problematic, or people were saying something they shouldn't. So it does happen in practice, and it's something to watch. The next thing we want to do is about standard setting. Who sets the standard? You know, how do you know whether what you're claiming is okay or not? So this is the entrepreneurial bit in the program, which is we're inviting experts in Africa to get together to discuss what those standards should be. on different crops for different uses. And the idea, hopefully, is it will become another module for people to be able to see. And then what they're going to do is look at all the crop uses, all the traits, try and think about innovative stuff, try and establish guidelines for how much data is needed to make claims, and best practices for putting data sheets together. This is the last 2 slides. I've rushed through that a little bit, but I'd love to know if anybody has been trained in any of this or knows any material around this. Absolutely love to hear about it. But one of the things I think, if you're looking for partners and trying to connect people, is it's very much about having common strategic objectives. Is if you're looking for a partner, they've got to really believe what you believe in terms of what your ultimate mission is. So if you want to give everything away free, there's no point in going to a commercial partner because they can't sustain their business like that. If they do believe in growing a new market and you've got something that you can grow that market because it's a good product, that's where you've got some common ground. Usually, our experience is you need somebody to help that conversation along. There needs to be an inducive environment to even invite, people. So can you invite multinationals on your site or SME? Or will the boss turn around and say, no, we deal with public goods here. What are you bringing them in for? If you haven't got a management environment or a legal environment or policy environment, then it's a non-starter. And don't ignore ownership. You've got to know who owns what it is you've produced. Because if you haven't got an owner, freedom to operate is unclear. Companies won't operate in an unclear situation. And respect. My view, people talk about trust and respect. My view is you've got to respect somebody to partner with them. If you don't, you're never going to trust them if you don't respect them to start with. But you probably won't trust them until you've worked with them for a while and that they do what they say. So respect is the thing I think is important. And then this is the last slide for our discussion. I said all of this, but it's really to get to the rub, which is when you're doing scientific research in crop improvement breeding, can you combine entrepreneurship? Can you combine working with seed companies with pure research, with applied research? I'd love to know your views around that, sort of the problems and the challenges and the joys of doing it. And then I'll stop now and just sort of ask you what. So thank you for listening. You've been very attentive.